Good. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to TAROE Trust's latest instalment of our webinar Wednesday. Today, the subject is on the, today we're meeting on the subject of stigma. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to mix things up a little bit today. I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Leslie Channon to chair today's session, and I'm going to be fulfilling a supporting role to facilitate all of the technology. Before I hand over, it's probably worthwhile highlighting that Leslie was one of the key people involved in the formation of the See the Person, or what was Benefit to Society campaign dating back several years, and we'll be hearing a little bit more about that and the work of that group alongside what Sarah Davis has to say later on in today's session from the Chartered Institute of Housing about some of that work. However, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Leslie. She'll give a bit of an introduction and run through a few more of the preliminaries, and I hope you enjoy today's session. So many thanks. Where are you?
Hello. You wouldn't let me unmute myself, so thank you. Welcome everyone. I am super excited about today's session. Many of you are aware, you know, the Benefit to Society campaign, that's now See the Person, was a huge momentum of actually getting it on an agenda. And since then, there have been several researches done on stigma and what that means to wider society, and also what it means to people living, particularly in the social housing sector. So what's going to happen today is we've got Mercy and Amans, who have done some research about stigma and social housing in England, that are going to talk for about 30 minutes, and they're going to have slides. We're going to have a quick, you can add any questions that you want in the chat. Darren is going to be, and I will be, while they're talking, looking at the chat function. So you'll be able to ask questions, have conversations in the chat. And then after that, Sarah Davis from CIH will be talking about the CIH's research on stigma and what they've discovered for about 15 minutes. And then there will be time for question and answers. This is being recorded, so you can go back and watch it on our YouTube when it's up and running after this session. The other great thing is that all of the slides you'll see today will be emailed to you after the session with a link to the YouTube. So feel free to share, so you don't have to make copious amounts of notes. You will be getting the slides after this session. So without further ado, I want to introduce Mercy and Amans to talk about their Durham University research that they've undertaken on stigma. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. So Mercy and I have been involved in social housing and human rights kind of advocacy for a while, and one of the things we picked up interest in was in stigma in social housing. Mercy, if you go on to the next slide, please. And what's, I think, the kind of thing which drew our attention, sorry, Mercy, if you go on to the next slide. No, yeah, okay. The one before that. Thank you. Yeah, okay. So one of the things which kind of drew our attention was the way the public perceives social housing. And this photo we have is a photo from an article in Inside Housing a couple of years ago. And on the face of it, it looks like a normal housing estate. But when you look through the tinted glasses, you see people who you would ordinarily have seen as normal through, a kind of biased lens. You see negative portrayals of these people. And that was what we were seeing with social housing. We were seeing, all these kind of negative portrayals. And we started to think, why is this happening? How did it come about? Who were the main actors involved, and how did they contribute to constructing this stigma? How were the tenants themselves experiencing this stigma, and what was being done to challenge this stigma? So that's kind of how we framed the research, and those were the things we were looking at, so our key objectives. In terms of what we did, we kind of approached it in different ways. First of all, we looked at kind of the history of social housing. So looked at archives, looked at interview video clips and press archives to see, how how social housing was portrayed in the past and how that portrayal had changed. We looked at social media to see, what was being said about social housing, what kind of campaigns were being run to challenge stigma in social housing. We also did a series of interviews and focus groups around England. In total, we spoke to over 200 people. And in terms of what we found, the first kind of thing we found was that you could think about social housing in two kind of distinct eras. One was kind of pre-1970, starting from post First World War, where you had social housing, what was then public housing, looked at as homes for returning heroes, and you had that kind of positive image of social housing. I mean, by the late 1960s, you had over a third of people living in social housing. Mas, if you go on to the next slide, please. You had over a third of people living in social housing. And that kind of positive image of social housing was there up till, say, early 70s. You started to see changes in this social perception. You started to see a negative image start to appear. A lot of it centered around construction of the estates, around lack of facilities, or starting to see social housing as substandard. But that stigma wasn't kind of intense. But by the time you moved on to, say, the Thatcher kind of era, Mas, if you go on to the next slide, please. What you started to see was a more intense stigmatization of social housing. This, was driven primarily by the politicians, their policies and politics. Things like the promotion of home ownership. So social housing was no longer a tenure of choice, but was now portrayed as a stepping stone to, home ownership. And so was looked at as an inferior tenure. You had things like the right to buy. You had changes in allocation policy, which residualized social housing. And on both sides of the aisle, you had, people or politicians use or vilify social housing to justify their policies. If you move to kind of 2010 and the kind of austerity regime we had then, you started hearing things like benefit cheats and scroungers and things like that being used to qualify social housing and its tenants, and in a bid to justify reforms to the welfare system. On the labor side, you had, things like sink estates being talked about, and things like that. Sometimes in a bid to justify investment, but they vilify first and stigmatize first. And the media picked up on that quite easily, and you had programs like Benefit Streets, and almost every media portrayal of social housing is negative. And in fact, we had people we spoke to say some of the TV crews would come and pay people to behave in an antisocial way so that they could film that and have those negative stories. The social housing providers themselves, there was a lot of stigma. We had people telling us their social housing providers treat them with disrespect, tell them that they are lucky to live in social housing. There's no consideration for, the fact that they work when repairs are fixed, things like that. And a lot of that could happen because there's an absence of a strong tenant voice at the local, regional, and national level. The other thing we saw with social housing was intersectionality. So what we think about stigma in social housing, and we think about it as one thing, it actually intersects with all sorts of other stigmas. And if you are thinking about tackling it, you need to think about those intersections. So, we saw intersections with stigma around drugs and crime. We saw some places where ex-offenders were housed in social housing, and kind of stigma that brought along with it. Intersections with mental health and disabilities. We have examples of places where people with mental health issues were put in social housing, and support wasn't deployed there also, and it generated a lot of stigma. Stigma around poverty, benefits, employment, class, all of that intersects with social housing. Stigma with race and immigration. Yesterday on ITV, there was the program around racial
racism
in social housing, and how that brings disrespect to the tenants, and the landlords, because of institutional racism, treats the tenants in certain ways because they are immigrants. Or so we have that. We also saw regional variations with stigma. So in the more urban areas, stigma was more intense. In the more rural areas, it was less intense. We saw generational variations. The older generations who had seen social housing, pre the 70s, have a different perception from the younger generation. There was also stigma around, the younger generation who have experienced the housing crisis being less prone to stigmatizing people. So we had those variations. We also had quite a lot around how people experience stigma. So I've mentioned about stigma from providers and contractors, from the police, differential policing of social housing estates, the GPs not allowing certain, or feeling that social housing tenants are not able to take care of themselves, so will not be able to go under some certain treatment regimes because they need some more application of their self. The council also, as a housing provider, treating its tenants, disrespectfully. We saw instances of postcode stigma where people were told, look, you're not getting that job because you live in this postcode where there's social housing. We saw people at work who said they were treated differently, because they lived in social housing. They were given certain types of assignments, which were regarded as rougher assignments. We saw people talking about their experiences in education where their teachers didn't feel they could achieve much and told them so. because they lived in social housing. We saw instances of poor doors, segregated entrances for homeowners and social tenants. We saw stigma from neighbors and from homeowners living in mixed tenure estates. So different, examples of stigma, and all of this impacting on their everyday lives, their life chances. So we saw quite a lot of that. In terms of challenging stigma, we saw a few approaches to challenging stigma. One of them, the government's preferred approach through planning, regeneration, mixed tenure estates. But again, a lot of that has not worked. And we saw quite a lot of stigma generated from mixed tenure estates. In terms of the associations themselves, we saw attempts to retrain staff, attempts to engage in or set up tenant engagement schemes and put tenants on board, things like that. But we also saw a disconnect between what the associations thought they were doing and what the tenants were experiencing. And so sometimes we saw associations who said, look, we're engaging in tenants to develop a strategy, and we walk into the next room and the tenants tell us, look, we've not heard of anything like that. We also saw, protests like art exhibitions against poor doors. And then we have things like the See the Person campaign, trying to put out counter narratives around what life in social housing looks like. So quite a number of approaches to challenging stigma, but all of them kind of limited in some way. Mercy, I'll give it over to you to speak.
And thank you, Mercy, and thank you for having us. So with the recommendations, what we did was not to be too prescriptive so that we can open it up for debate and people can have conversation around the issues around social housing stigma and how it affects their everyday realities. But what we mentioned in the report is that there's a need for government to see housing as a fundamental human right. And if there's a need for government and policymakers to see housing as a fundamental human right, then they need to adopt a right-based approach to housing. And that will include how they address the issue of affordable housing, how they address the issue of residualization of social housing to the most vulnerable in the community. And that will also help them to be aware of their stigmatizing language around home ownership as being a superior tenure of choice than renting. So we also mentioned that there's a need for them to focus on addressing the acute shortage of safe and affordable housing, which is something that everyone have been talking about. And if we need to address social housing stigma, we need to ensure that there is enough social housing accommodation out there so that people that need social housing can have access to it. So the government, they need to invest more in social housing and not just invest in leasehold housing. They need to invest more in social housing. Also, there's a need for the government to stop the use of stigmatizing language. So from all the interviews we did, we were aware of the government use of home ownership as a language that stigmatizes social housing tenants because they feel, they can't really afford to buy a home. And we need to bear in mind that it's not everybody that will be able to afford to own their own home. So those that can afford to rent, they should be given the opportunity to have access to affordable and safe accommodation. So they need to be aware of the language they use, the rhetoric they use around when they are promoting their home ownership or their housing policy, because to social housing tenants, it stigmatizes them. Also, we also mentioned the intersectionality, and we recognize that before we can address the issues around social housing stigma, they also need to pay attention to all the other stigmas, like the stigma around poverty, the stigma around employment, the stigma around class, the stigma around benefits, the stigma around race and immigration. Also, they need to recognize the stigma around mental health and disabilities, and how those who are seen as disabled are being treated within the social housing system. They also need to recognize the issues around drug and crime and how social housing are being allocated. They need to pay attention to their allocation policy. They need to address those other stigma before we can actually address stigma associated with social housing in this sector. So you can't address social housing stigma without paying attention to these other stigmas, because if you pay attention to social housing stigma, there's every probability that this other stigma will come and affect the social housing stigma which they're trying to address. And we've seen that as well with the government policy to introduce a mixed tenure system. Even though they are trying to address stigma, the impact of that has not been really felt, because those that we interviewed, they felt within the mixed tenure estate, those social housing elements and social housing tenants, they are being stigmatized for living within that estate. So even though they are trying to create a mixed tenure approach to addressing the housing crisis problem, to probably address the stigma, they are also creating problem because the fundamental issue have not been addressed. Also within the housing sector, one other thing that came up is the lack of tenant voice, the absence of tenant voice to challenge politicians, to challenge the media narrative, to challenge the housing providers narrative on how they engage with their tenant, how they provide services to their tenant. So there's a need to have a strong tenant voice at the national level, the regional level, and the local levels. And I'm sure people are having conversation around what they need to do to create this tenant voice. But one recommendation is we need to recognize that tenants need to be given a voice, and they need to have the power to drive the change they desire within the sector. Without that strong tenant voice, any other policy measure may not even have an effective impact within that sector. So they need to pay attention to tenant voice. Also, the regulatory system needs to change. They're like the housing providers, they need to ensure that they are held accountable and their tenants can hold them accountable for their action. And the housing ombudsman also, they need to pay attention to complaints, because one thing that came up is when tenants they lay complaint, that oftentimes they are being ignored and they are being disrespected. So the regulatory framework needs to be effective, and social housing provider need to be more accountable to their tenants. Also, there is a need to encourage a balanced and fairer reporting around social housing. The media need to pay attention and not just publish damaging report around social housing. They need to also identify those issues that they need to put in the public domain, that we enable people to see social housing as a tenure of choice and not a tenure of last resort. People need to pay attention. The media also need to pay attention to these issues. So what we did is to encourage debate around social housing issues, and in encouraging the debate, we put out a set of consultation questions, which a lot of people have already responded to. So thank you to as many of you that have responded to the consultation question. But while we've recognized that people have responded to the recommendation, to the consultation question, we are also encouraging people to carry on this debate within the housing association, in their focus group meetings and advocacy group meetings, to make as much noise around these issues, around stigma, so that people can be compelled to pay attention and then address the issue. Because when you look at how social housing stigma affect people, it affects their life chances, it affects their everyday reality, it affects how their children are being perceived within the society. So we can't just keep quiet. We need to continue the process. We need to keep engaging. We need to keep debating the issue. We need to keep engaging different stakeholders within the sector to address this problem. So that's our presentation today. Thank you for listening, and we are open for questions. If you have any question, comment, feedback, observation, we're happy to take them. Thank you. Seems Leslie is not in. Hello, Leslie. I need to be unmuted. Okay. Okay, I think there's a technical problem going on. So,
sorry, I think Leslie has been made a co-host, so she can unmute now.
okay.
Oh, I'm back. Hello. I'm not admin, so I can't control muted or unmuting myself. Thank you so much. I'm like reading the chat. It's very interesting. I'm kind of wondering if well, someone said, Sandy Moore said, in the report, one of the questions is, should social housing be a human right? I agree. Although it would require millions of more housing to be built and available, but would there be a danger of then creating the same situation we have now by making a bottom level of tenants again, which would bring its own stigma again?
Let's say, I guess one of the other ways of wording that might be, are there downsides to establishing housing as a human right?
I think when we start to see housing as a right, one of the things we need to do is to ensure that there's an adequate supply of housing for everyone. I think, again, this is where the complexity comes in. As much as we try to deny it, we're a class-based society. And so those intersections with class and with things like race will then start to feature a bit more prominently also. And we then need to think about how do we address that. In other countries where you have more of a rented sector than a home ownership sector, they've dealt with those, or they've started to deal with those. I guess you would always have some sort of a private rented sector alongside the public rented sector. But I think other societies have dealt with it, and there's a sense that we can deal with it also if we put our minds to it.
I know, I agree, because you know, in Germany, lots of people rent. It isn't a and it's affordable, and it's a choice. And also in America, I lived in America for 16 years, and renting, because you want to be mobile or kind of moving around, there's more access to housing and rented accommodation. So I think that one of the things I wanted to bring up was the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, being, you know, having air, water, food, and shelter is like the base of what a human, you know, what people need. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Does anyone else have any? I'm kind of reading through. If we wanted to, if you have a specific question for Mercy and Amans, if you put them in the chat, what we're going to do now is move to Sarah Davis and talk about the CIH's research and see how it correlates with the Durham University study. So welcome, Sarah. And
thank you.
I will hand the reins over to you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Privileged to speak after Mercy and Amans, because that's a great report. I will just share my screen. Hopefully, if I'm, yeah. And it should be that one, I think. Can you see that? Is it appearing?
Yes, brilliant.
Brilliant. That's fine, because it comes up nicely with the notes for me, and that always throws me somewhat, so I can make sure I know what I'm doing. I'm just going to pop that down. Thank you. Right, so thank you ever so much for inviting me to talk about the guide. It's Not Okay, which is about tackling stigma I'm from the Chartered Institute of Housing. Hopefully people know we're the professional body for people working in housing. So a lot of our members work in housing associations, council, consultants, academics, etc. So that's our kind of background. And this is something where we really wanted to feel that we could contribute and play a part, but it took us a while to sort of find a focus on it. And we were really pleased to work with See the Person on the guide. Just wondering if it's, yeah. So I won't touch on this too much because we've all, you know, it's been gone into in much more detail by Mercy and Amanda, the kind of trends and the history of where stigmas merged around the social housing, both social housing itself, the people who live there, and also organisations sometimes that deliver it. But just more recently, it's obviously become far more focused and problematic. And I think probably the first sort of step in identifying it and wanting to tackle it was, to be fair, the Benefit to Society See the Person campaign, which was established to challenge the unfair stereotyping of people who lived in social housing. And a few years ago now, CIH did a major project talking to our members, to people, tenants in social housing, councillors, you know, people around the kind of social housing sector, to ask questions about what we thought was the role and purpose of social housing and its value. And that report is still free on our website for anyone who wants to read it. And a lot of very positive messages came out about the role of social housing, the benefits for the households who live within it, the benefits for the communities within which it's situated, the role it can play towards helping people you know, develop themselves and their talents, and for health and well-being. But a big thread through that came out clearly, which was around the way that people who live within social housing are perceived, the way they are stereotyped, the kind of assumptions that are made. And I mean, obviously we know that it became very much more of a focus with the tragedy of Grenfell and the huge and clear thread that came out as we started looking at that, about people feeling they weren't listened to because they were tenants, because they were social housing tenants. And as a result of the discussions around that, it was an actual full chapter in the Social Housing Green Paper. And when we got the white paper coming out, it was a bit of a shame. It wasn't that there wasn't that same focus, although you could argue it was a thread running through it. So there's been a momentum around actually recognizing that this stigma exists, that it causes problems, and that there's a need to address it on a multiple level. And the causes are complex. And again, Mercy and Amanda have covered this, but there's the huge housing shortage that we have. There are housing policies that privilege, in particular, home ownership as the tenure that people really want or aspire to. There's the sense that social housing has become a safety net as it's shrunk in its proportion of the overall housing stock of our country. And then there's obviously social media and media in terms of how it has portrayed people. So, you know, there's quite a complex and interwoven mix of things that are contributing to this. But one of the things for CIH that was important was to take stock of what part the actual sector itself was playing in stigma, and specifically organisations that provide social housing and people working within it. I think it's fair to say that the big set of research that See the Person did with the LSE came up with some really uncomfortable points for us to take on board, and both in terms of actually people, organisational structures and management practices, but also individuals, how we talk, how we present ourselves towards tenants, and also externally towards the communities, both in terms of language and behaviours, but also how social housing organisations itself talked about its communities and neighbourhoods and the people that they serve there to serve. So it was a challenge, and for CIH it was about, well, what do we do around that? And the challenge hasn't gone away. I think even after our guide, you know, still more things are really coming up in terms of, you know, the conditions in which people sometimes have to put up with, a sense for the sector to think about whether it's really fulfilling its social purpose and ethos. Have we lost empathy with tenants? Are we listening, or are we actually just kind of ticking the boxes to get the housing management functions done, so to speak? How are we talking to communities? And for councils and boards, you know, that are responsible for the organisations, you know, how do we take stock? And I say we there because I have a trustee hat for an almshouse. You know, how do we know how our tenants actually feel about some of the services we deliver, and how they receive them? So we really wanted to take stock and to encourage people to stop and take stock, both our members, the individual professionals, and the organisations for which they worked. And we worked with See the Person, because obviously their research had really raised the issue about, you know, social housing organisations and people working in it do need to stop and think about things. So what we wanted to do was to deliver something that was aimed at housing providers, at the contractors who work within the sector, at partners, and not necessarily a big stick, but actually just to say, we need to stop. We need to take time out of the busyness of doing what we're doing and think about our language, our behaviour, the design of the services and how we deliver them. And what are they saying to our tenants about our value, the value we put on their involvement with us, the services we give to them, the homes that we deliver. For us, it's fundamentally that respectful and professional practice has to play a part in tackling stigma. And we wanted the work not only to help the sector and professionals stop and think in a snapshot, but actually to embed it in our professionalism programme, so that actually thinking about, reflecting on why we work within this sector and the things that we do helps us to actually recognise and tackle any problematic behaviour or language. So we did this work with See the Person, and it started out as a survey, and we were hoping to roll out focus groups, etc., to have a big conversation about it. But then COVID hit, so it ended up being a very long, extended survey, and we got a lot of interest and a lot of feedback. It was obviously aimed first and foremost at tenants, but we left it open so that housing professionals could also engage with it, and others. And of course, some of our members are also tenants. We don't necessarily know and identify that, but it is a fact. In some of the feedback and comments that we got, it was clear that people were wearing two hats when they were responding. But through all of that survey, we found there were some fundamental areas that most of the comments could be grouped under, and that these were some of the pivotal areas where issues were coming up. So the big issues that came back to us was the fact that even the social landlords and the people working for them can be making assumptions about tenants within social housing in the same way that external communities might. You know, the assumption that tenants are in social housing because they don't work, because they're on benefits. And those assumptions could lead to poor or even discriminatory treatment, you know, condescending and patronising, as some of the least of that, but obviously, you know, it can go beyond that as well. And that it meant that people felt that professionals sometimes could feel that they didn't really have to listen to tenants properly or necessarily act on their concerns. And, you know, we know that can lead to some very fundamental, real serious risks and dangers for people. but also massively contributing to a sense of people feeling made other and less than. So some of the quotes that came back were around the toxic culture of judgmental behaviour and dismissiveness around tenants rather than listening to them. It follows through sometimes on the standards of work in our homes that we accept or that we don't check on, as if it doesn't matter because the tenants themselves aren't paying for it. So it doesn't really matter what standard the work is done to. And also, and I suppose this goes alongside with not really having an active listening or caring approach, is a tick box even to involvement. So, you know, obviously consulting after the event or when decisions have already been made, not really listening about the issues around homes and estates and involving tenants in the solutions that they would prefer. And also, obviously, a feeling that landlords and their staff are becoming removed and are fundamentally about business and not community. And whilst the sector likes to talk about having a kind of business head and a social heart, some of the feedback was very much that they feel that the steer is much more towards business, much more towards development, much more towards, you know, different products in terms of the homes, rather than actually the communities and the people who live in them. So we didn't just want people to talk to us about what the problems were, because I think some of that had become much more known, but also, well, what did we need to do? We wanted to challenge back to the sector and to professionals to say, what are the solutions? And that was fantastic, because that's what we got. And fundamentally, it is about the culture in the organisation, about recognising that some of the stigma that people experience actually does come from professionals or does come from the way the organisation manages itself without consideration of what works for tenants. And that we needed to develop a zero tolerance approach and have clear complaints procedures and really be seen not only to understand it, but to tackle it. About being accessible and accountable within their communities and for their homes. And being really clear around communications is pivotal to all of this, but it's fundamentally about recognising the value of the involvement in communities, the volunteering, the work, all that social housing residents do within their communities, and celebrating this and recognising the diversity within our communities as well. Having meaningful tenant and resident involvement, that can be seen to have an impact, you know, that does and is seen to have an impact. Listening to people, because at the end of the day, people are living in those homes and experiencing the problems with them. People are living on those estates or in those communities and really understand what the issues are. So it's not assuming that we have the answers, but listening to some of the experts and working together on solutions. And it is about being rigorous about good standards of homes, neighbourhoods, maintenance, and doing the invest to save in a way that we probably consider doing, you know, in our homes, we would do. So these are people's homes, our homes, and your homes. So it's actually, what would we want to happen? How do we invest? How do we make sure their quality? What's the experience of living in them, and how can we improve them? And that is a big challenge coming up with net zero, for example. And fortunately, there is quite a lot around how tenants and people living in communities are actually being able to talk about what they want to see happen around their homes, what's important to them. Fundamentally for staff, it's about recruitment, training and development. It's about recognising that stigma is a form of discrimination, so including that in equality and diversity and inclusion training. It's about recruiting people for kind of attitudes and behaviours. We can give them the knowledge and the skills. It's about just getting people to reflect on why you're working in the sector you're working in and what are you trying to achieve with it. And going back to the standards, actually making sure that we develop homes that add to communities and that add to that, you know, experience. So in terms of the design and the quality and the safety of those communities. I said we wanted to embed this in the challenge for ourselves and our members, and the professionalism agenda that we're working on is about understanding that housing is a profession, and it is about making ethical choices and having a lot of knowledge that you can bring to bear on what you do to make sure you do it really well. And some of that is around actually recognising that we have a responsibility to challenge stigma, to tackle negative stereotyping, to equip ourselves with understanding that we can challenge back and challenge within organisations as well as externally. Just if you wanted to take a look at it, so that when you get the slides, that's the link. And I think also there's a challenge for us, and I don't know whether a lot of people here today are probably actively involved in your landlord's governance structures, whether on boards, scrutiny panels, residents associations, etc. So actually, how do we play our part in that? So, it's a question of thinking about some of the things we need to ask and challenge regularly within some of those meetings that we have around governance. So what do we say about customer service and responsiveness? And has that been set with, with tenants? And are they happy with them? Do they think they're adequate? And also not just the procedures we set, but how do we know they're working and that we're meeting them? And what kind of assurance or audit do we have? And how do we make sure that staff and tenants together are doing that check together around safe through scrutiny, etc.? What opportunities do customers have to raise red flags that the organisation's governance structure can see? So, including boards. Actually, do we have a process to make sure we're doing that safety check? What training around stigma and discrimination do staff have? When? How effective is it? What's the impact? Do we pass the friends and relatives test? Would tenants say, I'm happy with my landlord, I'm happy with my community, they listen to me, I would recommend that my landlord. And for professionals, do we always challenge stigmatizing behaviour or language within the workplace? And are we equipped to do that? Do we feel confident in that? Because that can be challenging, particularly perhaps if we are new in our profession and just starting out. Do I think about my my personal preferences and views, and is there, are they influencing things where they should or shouldn't? Am I behaving in an ethical manner? Would I be happy if my language or actions were made public? And do I follow up on what I say I'm going to do? If I've given a guarantee to a tenant that I will act on X, Y, and Z, am I doing it? Am I feeding back if there's anything cropping up, etc.? And why do we think professionalism is an important element within tackling stigma? I think it's really important around for boards to make sure that actually you have well-equipped staff who are setting high standards of the services they want to deliver for residents and making sure that they do, and that they are actually delivering the way that tenants expect. I think also for myself as a housing professional, it's about really making sure I'm up to date and that I'm able to respond to queries from tenants, that I'm ambassador for social housing, and that I am equipped to challenge where wrong impressions are still hold, and about having the equipment to make really good ethical and professional decisions. For tenants themselves, I think what we want to do with this is set a benchmark for the attitudes and behaviours that people should be able to expect from staff, and a framework that means it can challenge personal, unacceptable and unprofessional behaviour, and where we're equipping people, as I say, to do that challenge against bias and discrimination where we see that crop up. So for us, the stigma guide is also something that we wanted to follow through within the professionalism standard, and think about actually, you know, making sure that it's not just a one-off guide that actually helps us to stop and take stock, but actually helps us build in that whole reflective practice that was one of the challenges that came through really strongly in the survey. So that's a snapshot of the guide and the work it's having, the impact it's having on CIH. So I'm really happy to have been able to share it with you and looking forward to the questions and getting involved in the discussion. So I'm going to try and work out now how I stop sharing.
Thank you, Sarah. Sandy had a question. I've been meaning to, I was wanting to jump in. I was just holding my tongue. That last slide was absolutely, great. But she's asking, what do we do? What do we need in place to protect tenants being in fear of speaking out or challenging their landlord?
That is a challenging one. I suppose some of it would be if it's on a professional basis, if they're members, there is always the our body that we can, and we have a code of ethics and a code of practice. But the landlord, it is a difficult issue, isn't it? And I think there's obviously there's the ombudsman, and I think they're being much more proactive, where complaints might be about particular issues and complaints. Obviously, it's the complaints process that tops up on, but I think it's been very much more active on that. There is, we're still waiting for legislation to come in that will enable the regulator to have a much stronger customer focus. I think it's difficult, but I think there are routes around the civic routes for complaints and raising issues. So your councillors still, particularly if you're a council tenant, I think it's multiple, and it depends it depends on how severe the issue is, I think. But there isn't an easy route at the moment.
I know, and I think as we're seeing in the Grenfell inquiry, that the tenants that were raising concerns were dismissed as, oh, those pesky tenants, and we kind of hear that a lot. And so how do we use, CIH's influence and more research coming out to kind of change that narrative, that if as a tenant, if I speak out, I'm going to be labeled, oh, that tenant always complains, or that tenant is all, and kind of be labeled one of the, stigmatizing, that I'm, being branded a busybody. So, I mean, I think that when I was talking to Paul Hackett, when they were dealing with Amicus Horizon, and turning it around, it takes a really long time to change a culture within an organization. Yes. He said, he came in and his whole executive team was new. And I said, well, there's always those staff that are reluctant to change. And will do stuff just to kind of rub against the grain. And I said, so how did you deal with those reluctant for change? And he looked me straight in the face and said, they no longer work here.
Yeah.
But that isn't, that has to be the kind of golden thread that, if you don't get on board with it, the agenda of the culture change, you will no longer work here. And I think that when that is really clear, and then also just with the the contractors and the thing, I know that Soha Housing, for example, had their contractors sign up to say, sign up to the Stigma pledge, or so there's things that can be done. I know Darren has been following the chat as well. Darren, did you want to come in and ask some questions for the the panelists.
I mean, just on that point, I guess the other thing is some of the sector development work that we're seeing. There's going to be stronger consumer regulation. That's the kind of the bottom line threshold where they say, really, what we want to see is for culture change throughout organisations, and hopefully the backstop regulation isn't going to be required, because organisations will. Certainly the good organisations are going to say, look, we recognise the importance of this and going to do something about it. But where they don't, there is in the future going to be the RSH's ability to step in. I have got a few questions, Leslie, just from the chat that other people have been raising, but I know Sandy wanted to come in with a question as well. So if I can bring Sandy in first.
Yeah.
Hi, Sandy.
Great. So I'm unmuted now. The last slide was absolutely brilliant. Yes, but the thing is, the onus is permanently on the tenant all the time. The tenant has to raise their heads, and then they have to push and find out the information themselves. They have to find out where they stand. They need help from the organisations, because sometimes they are not listened to. And if you do put your head up, yes, there is always that danger of pesky tenant again. Yes. So, but us pesky tenants are the ones who have to keep trying to learn, find the information to help the other tenants sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's the onus all the time. I know you say about the ombudsman, but that means that we have to then put something together to make sure it's factual, to make sure it's right, take it to the ombudsman, take it anywhere to try and get your words out, basically.
I completely get your point on that, Sandy, and I think that Darren is right. Although the kind of legislation is not imminent, that will give the regulator that stronger role around consumer standards, they are very clear, leading from the front around organisations having to get their culture right and not waiting for their stronger consumer powers. And some of that is about actually being a bit more, organisations being a lot more proactive, rather than just meeting the basics around making it clear on their websites about their complaints policy and what tenants can do afterwards. I think fundamentally it is about boards making sure, and that's why I'd encourage people to take the reports that Mercy and Amans have produced and our guide, and encourage, if you're involved in the governance structure of your organisations, to say to your boards, have you read this? Because I think it's really about boards having an assurance that actually the ethos under which that organisation is operating, which is fundamentally usually about providing good homes and good services, that's the bottom line, that they are actually living that out, and they do take on board that kind of culture change. One of the things that came back strongly from our survey was, to tackle individuals perhaps that are problematic within an overall good organisation, is the clarity and follow through around complaints around individuals, and having that kind of almost like a whistleblower sort of positive response. So I think you're right. I think a lot of organisations would not want to be obstructive, but sometimes it's just the management practice, and they don't realise that actually can be. And so for me, there's very much around the experience of tenants to say, these are some of the easy solutions where you could make it easier for the bulk of your tenants, not just your experienced tenants who are used to kind of like championing the cause, but actually to really tackle that. And I think a lot of it we would want to do and should be co-designed with tenants because of your experience and expertise.
What do you think, Amans?
I think underlying a lot of this discussion around tenants is a power imbalance between the tenants and the landlords, and that was picked up in the green paper, but not so much followed up in the white paper. And the real issue then is, how do you address that power imbalance? How do you make the housing associations, the councils more accountable to their tenants. Some of it has to do with information flows. As much as it's a regulated sector and a lot of information flows to the regulator, a lot of info, it's still quite an opaque system, and a lot of the tenants don't have access to a lot of the information which they should have access to. It becomes difficult for the tenants to speak. So I think it's how do we create governance systems, how do we create transparency systems which put that power in the tenant's hands.
Darren, I think we have some more questions. Did you say that you have some more questions?
Yeah, sure, Leslie. Okay, yeah, I'm going to kind of bring a few together, I think, because there's been loads of really positive chat that's been going on today. I guess the first one I'm going to kind of bring together is to what extent do you think that this is a sector-related issue, and therefore the sector has the ability to respond, versus it being a kind of a wider societal related issue? In that many of the things that we're seeing in the sector might be a reflection of some of the prejudices that exist more generally. And then another one which is very kind of specific, which someone might like to comment, is as part of your research, have you seen any really good examples that maybe kind of reverse the stereotypes? So that might be examples of really positive community-based activities, or even, and I think it might have been Sandy that picked up around housing design. A lot of the time, it's the very design of the housing which can help to kind of contribute to both the identification and then the associated stigma of the sector. So a couple of things maybe to think of that anyone like to come in on?
In terms of whether it's the sector can respond, or so whether it's sector specific or whether it's a reflection of society, I think it's somewhere in between. There are things the sector can respond to and should respond to. So like the things like the power imbalances and the ways in which the sector itself contributes to this stigma can be addressed by the sector. But there are other wider societal issues. So like we picked up on kind of the politicians and the way politics, creates a lot of the stigma and, government policies and all of that. And in a sense, those are not within the sector's power to change. They can campaign, they can try to influence, but ultimately, it lies outside their power. And so, in a sense, there's that aspect which also needs to be tackled. I mean, there are parallels, maybe not complete parallels, but say with mental health stigma, there's been quite a lot of work done over the years on that, and things are beginning to shift in the broader society. And I think as work, as the sector starts to do work with this, as they start to partner with people in the wider society, things will start to shift. But we need to see that work, start and gain momentum.
Yeah, I think in addition to what you've said, Amazi, I absolutely agree with what you've said. The sector needs to respond, and that is obvious from what Sarah has said and from our findings. The way the sector acts is they need to be conscious of the role they play in stigmatizing the social housing tenant and what they need to do to address the problem. So, and the society also needs to respond, like the language used by politicians when justifying their welfare reform, when justifying their housing policies, stigmatize social housing tenants. Why it's good to encourage people to own their own home, they also need to bear in mind that they need to be very conscious of
how their language stigmatizes those that cannot afford to own their own home. And they need to tone it down as well, because the language they use either reinforces what the media put out, and if the politician cannot adjust their language or be conscious of how they use their language, and the media will pick up on it. And if the media picks up on it, then they will start publishing negative reports around social housing. And the society also will read those media reports and also respond in line with it. So the media need to respond, the politicians, they need to respond, the society need to pay attention to how social housing tenants are being viewed. And also the sector need to respond. For instance, we've been talking about the lack of training. Social housing providers, they need to provide adequate training to their staff, so that particularly the frontline staff, and they need to address the disconnection between the board level and the frontline staff and the housing, social housing tenant complaint system. How they need to ensure that that disconnection is what is minimized. The social housing tenant, they need to listen to them as often as possible. Let me respond to Sandy's earlier question around if a social housing tenant does not want to be at the forefront of complaining, how can they engage with the social housing tenant? Is there any platform for the social housing tenant to engage? I think that's a question that we need to also pay attention to. It's not everybody that wants to come out and say, okay, I want to complain, I want to be seen as a key person. But the question is, the system, the sector, do they have a platform in place to enable social housing tenants who will not want to come forward to put their complaint out there, to actually complain, to actually engage with the system? What governance system has been enacted within the system, within the sector, to encourage those social housing tenants to engage? And how does how is that governance implemented within the entire sector itself, so that they have like a uniform governance system, and what is obtainable in housing A, social housing A, is also obtainable in social housing B. So we need to encourage uniformity. If we have to address stigma, the training has to be uniform across different housing associations. And the social housing tenants, whether they want to come forward or they don't want to come forward, they need to have a platform to engage with the sector itself. So, in terms of reversing the stereotype, I mean, still the person, they've been doing a lot to reverse that stereotype. They've put out so many narratives around the everyday realities of social housing tenants, and they've tried to do that. But the question we need to then ask ourselves, what more can we do to ensure that that negative narrative or stereotype is eradicated? I think that is what we need to do. What do we need to do more to ensure that the narrative around social housing stigma within the society is eradicated?
Thank you so much. I'm just going to say, and I'm going to bring Sarah in for a quick comment, but when we were working on the Benefit Society campaign, that's now the See the Person, we created a fair press guide, and we had a lot of press sign up to be able to, so, you know, whenever there's some kind of narrative, there's always a kid with a shopping trolley with no shoes. It's just like, what are the images that are perpetuating that stereotype? So Sarah, if you come in for some last comments, and then we are going to need to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say that there are some really good examples across the sector of organisations that really work well with their tenants, co-design services, etc. And there are some examples in the guide, but there are obviously many more than that. And there are also some fantastic examples where at a community level, tenants social housing with other residents in the area are actually really, you know, really pivotal on leading around services within their community that meet shared needs. So there are some excellent examples, and certainly not to lump organisations together. But I think, and I was going to mention the Fair Press for Tenants, because it's multiple, isn't it? It's not just, I suppose from my perspective, I'm talking about professionals and the sector, because that's where we have a voice and those are our constituents, our members. but it is multiple, and the power imbalance happens at lots of different levels. So we need lots of different ways to address it. So the sector, taking its responsibility, the challenge of the fair press to tenants, which was an excellent guide, and which shaped a bit of how I approached our guide. And obviously CIH was hugely involved with when there was a national tenants voice, because yes, fundamentally at that national level, setting the policy and setting the agenda and bringing tenants' voices with an equal weight alongside, government decision makers and the sector. We do need that. So we do need something like a national tenants voice. However,
absolutely. I mean, Taroe's stance and my stance personally is that when decisions are being made about tenants that are going to affect the lives of tenants need a seat at the table.
Yeah.
So with that, thank you, all three of you. The chat is going wild. The chat is going to be saved, and then I will go through and then kind of clean it up for conversation, and that can be the highlights can be sent through. Just a reminder, in 2 weeks' time we have the building safety webinar Wednesday coming. We will give you an update and a link to that. And thank you so much for your time today. I know that it's we're preaching to the converted. All of you are really, really involved in looking at all the names, and been reading fervorously the chat. And there's so much brilliance that tenants can bring to the table. For me, I am a shared owner. I was a full renter before I bought my home as a shared ownership home. I came through scrutiny. So I know how working for a really good organization can be, and I've also worked within the sector. So thank you guys so much for your time and for continuing to support TAROE Trust. Is there anything else that we need to cover, Darren, before we sign off?
No, that's great. Just thanks to the speakers for giving the time today. Really well appreciated. And thanks to everybody for joining and participating today. It's much appreciated.
I also think that, are there hard copies? I know I saw someone was asking about hard copies of the research. I know that there's online links and stuff like that, but are there actually hard published copies or no?
No. I mean, we didn't get enough funding to produce hard copies. So
I understand that. Yeah. So I think that was James that was asking that question. So you're going to have to wait a little bit. But so we will be sending the links to all the research, and I can also include the Fair Press Guide as well. So that is it's really great, and we can continue this conversation. It's a to be continued ... Hopefully we can have you back in a couple of months to kind of see where we're at, just kind of coming out of COVID and how we're all going to be living in this new world. So thank you all today for coming, and we hope to see you very, very soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.